We're sitting here and we're at the workshop Science in Sudelfeld in Germany. And there's a couple of scientists here who have interacted with Albert for quite some time. And we just want to share some stories with you about Albert. And maybe before I start, let's introduce our guests today. We have Klaus Mosegaard from Copenhagen, Andreas Fichtner from Zurich, Jan Capdeville from Nantes, Jeannot Trampere from Utrecht, Rachel Wood from Edinburgh, and myself, Heine Igel from the University of Munich. And let me myself just start and actually maybe tell the story how I ended up being a PhD student with Albert. So I was in Edinburgh. I was kind of a master student or visiting student in Edinburgh, and suddenly it occurred I might want to do a PhD in science, and I had considered going to the west coast of the United States. We talked about the west coast today. And I had always been, and that's kind of an independent thing, I'd always been fascinated by the problem of having an opinion on something, even in everyday life. I was always fascinated by people having very strong opinion. And at that point, I considered maybe why not going to France, and then I asked people, who is in France or who is in Paris doing something interesting in geophysics, and I always heard one name, Tarantola. So I went to the library and got a book, Inverse Problem Theory, where actually some said it's not even English, the title. They criticized it's not even an English title. So I opened the book, and the preface starts like, humans were born naked worms. Humans were born naked worms. And I thought, this guy has humor. Starting a mathematics book like this. And actually the book or the philosophy is about having an opinion on, to some extent, having an opinion about a physical system and describing the state of information of a physical system with probability theory. And I was really fascinated from a philosophical point of view by this. And I was always lucky. I went to Paris. At the time I knew Alfred Hirn. And I just went, I asked, can I visit you? And I only wanted to see Albert, but I didn't call him. I was maybe too shy to ask, is he there? But I was lucky. So he was there. So I went into his office, and I had actually been looking at the West Coast for a PhD supervisor. And I always expected I want to fall in love with a supervisor, not physically, but philosophically, intellectually. And I had actually talked to Bob Parker, to Freeman Gilbert, to George Bacchus at Scripps, and others along the West Coast, and I didn't fall in love with any of them. Albert, it clicked in his office. It just clicked. So it kind of went both ways. We were, it just worked out. And at some point he said, why don't you come? I have money for you as a PhD student. So that's how I ended up in Paris. So I start with this story, and then maybe I think Jan has a story why he did not end up as a PhD student with Jan. You want to tell you?
Oh, okay. So I spent 12 years in IPGP, so I know many stories with Albert. I've seen many of those, and so I will talk only about the one I've really personally seen. So indeed, my first interaction with Albert was back in probably May 1994. So I was not even a master student at the time. I was a student in theoretical physics. And at that time I had to do an internship in a company. And it was not easy to find internship because there was an economical crisis at that time. So I sent a few letters. There were very little internet at the time, so you had to send handwritten letters to get internship. And I sent one to CGG Veritas company. And surprisingly enough, they asked me to show up for an interview. I was really worried because I said that I was very interested into geophysics, which was I knew nothing about it. At the time, for me, seismology and volcano was the same. Anyway, they only asked questions about Fortran and vectorization at the time. I was not hired, but I had the internship. And in the same floor, there were a girl, Emmanuelle Juvet, who was doing an internship with PhD thesis with Albert. And once in the coffee room, she told me, "Oh, if you're into geophysics, why don't you come to see pizza seminar with Albert?" So every Thursday, he was doing a pizza seminar with his students. I guess you remember that. So basically, the system was he was organizing, bringing food, and the PhD student was giving a seminar about his thesis. And as I understood it afterwards, it was the main and probably only interaction he would have with his student. Sometimes.
Except Café Beaubourg?
Yeah, but that was after. And so Emmanuelle Juvet took me there, and so one reason I like very much this story is because it's involving two friends, Albert Tarantola and Dimitri Komatic, and both of them passed away, and both of them were really friends, and so I like this story. It's very emotional for me. So anyway, so I ended up there, and the guy who was presenting his seminar was Dimitri Komatic. And so he had just started his PhD for a few months, and basically he had no time to do any research yet. So he chose to present a paper, and the paper was about gravity inversion in Piton de la Fournaise volcano. So exactly the figure you presented a few hours ago. And if you know Albert, what I'm going to tell you really will trigger something in you. So at some point, Dimitri, during the presentation, say, "And the solution of the inverse problem is." So if you know Albert, you know that just after this sentence, it's over. So suddenly you will see the water red level go up, and then boom. So Albert says, "There is no such a thing as solution of an inverse problem in gravity inverse problem. What are you talking about?" So the poor Dimitri was trying to defend himself, say, "Yeah, it's not me, it's in the paper." I say, "I don't give a shit about the paper. You said it, you're responsible for what you said." And that was over. So, amazingly enough, he managed to finish his seminar. And in the end, so Albert stand up, and he was a bit cooled down, and I thought he would say something nice in the end, and Dimitri, that was a terrible seminar." So, afterwards, the other student took me to have a drink there, and they say, "Wow, that's tough, you know." And so Emmanuelle Juvet told me, "Oh no, that's fine, you know. Last week he tried to pull into pieces the slide of the guy."
But may I add, I think that's what was one of the positive seminars, because there was another PhD student called Dmitry Pizarenko, and he spent, shared office, so he spent all night preparing an animation, and this was early 90s. Preparing an animation was something difficult. And Dimitri was aware that the color scale was not really right, or something happened, or something was flickering in the color scale in his animation that he was presenting in the pizza seminar. So he started the pizza seminar, and he started to talk, and he started presenting his animation. And again, and I think this is a theme that will reappear, Albert was getting redder and redder. He screamed, he stood up, he went to the plug of the monitor, he pulled it out, and he said, "If you're not ready, don't give the talk." And that was it. So that was the positive.
So just to finish the story, I just recently realized that the guy who had the slide pulled into pieces was Roland Martin. Because I was asked to tell this story a few months ago, and he said, "Oh, that was me." And so after that, I thought that seismology is a very interesting subject, and that I would do a master in IPGP and probably a PhD, but not with Albert. That's exactly what happened, and actually I had maybe 10 years after, I had many interaction with him. Maybe I'll tell a bit about this. But I was glad not to do a PhD with him, because even though he could be a very nice guy, he could also be not as nice, especially with students. But actually, what is amazing is even with these crazy stories, if you talk to his former student, they all love him. So.
Jeannot, you have actually Jeannot organized a meeting in Utrecht in 2009.
2009, just
in
before
July.
the States. Yes, that's right.
And that's also where I saw him last time, and maybe you have some memories to share.
Well, not about that meeting, because I have forgotten about everything about that. But I have much more earlier memories of Albert. And actually, I never, in the beginning, when I was a PhD student, that was when he developed his theory with Bernard Valette. And I actually never got to know Albert for that time, but I got to know Bernard Valette because he gave the course about their theory. And I do not know if any of you know Bernard Valette, but it was sort of a very unusual combination of scientists, really. So Bernard's course was basically a generalization of the 1982 paper. Now, it's already very hard to understand the 1982 paper. Now, a generalization of that thing, that was sort of a very tough thing. And I managed to get through it. It was not the best course I ever had in terms of marks, but anyway. When I then entered my PhD, I volunteered to be the assistant to Bernard Valette to explain to the students what all that was about. And that is how I got to appreciate all this inconsistency problem. And so at that point I never met Albert at all. And then I entered my PhD and I wrote my first paper. And in those days there was tomography going on. And it was all about solving large-scale linear inverse problems. And in the medical side, they're doing algebraic reconstruction techniques. And so I worked on that. And there was sort of a competitive group which started to look into what is called LSQR, least squared conjugate gradient methods. And that was the Utrecht group. And they never came to the same answer. And the Utrecht group thought they had a better answer to the other people. So we started to analyze this problem with Jean-Jacques Levesque, and we submitted a paper. And we basically concluded that it was a nonsense argument because we were discussing the consistency problem. And we submitted this paper to JGR. You all know JGR is a very applied paper. But Albert Tarantola was the editor. The reviewers were the Utrecht people, and it got completely destroyed. And Albert decided to publish the paper anyway, because it actually got to the bottom of it that LSQR and simultaneous iterative reconstruction techniques, they solved the same problem, but they put both implicit priors in, and therefore you must get to other answers. And the other people never got to this, and he said the world has to know that this can't be, and he sort of published the paper. So that was, before that I never met Albert, and then later on, of course, I got to know him, and funnily enough, I now occupy the chair in Utrecht, where I had this very early controversy with the people who occupied it before me. And Albert then came many times to Utrecht. I invited him and he gave inverse theory classes to the PhD students. And I remember one of the sessions was, and Klaus was mentioning it, is a little bit about how do you draw a prior from a geological thing. And he was talking to the PhD students for more than a day about how you generate random samples, and he was completely talking over their heads. And but then the next day he realized that he didn't do this correctly, and then his pedagogical insight was so deep that in the end he managed to convey that message to them, and they all loved his class in the end. He was an absolutely formidable teacher, I think, and that is really how I got friends with him. He came then many more times to Utrecht, and I could tell a lot of stories that in the evening we went out to the restaurants and things like this, and we talked about Catalan politics, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to go there.
Don't. I had this discussion too.
Okay, very good.
Well, when you say just one story, when you say he was a gifted teacher, when we organized a workshop actually on inverse problem during our SPICE meetings in Kinsale.
Yes.
I invited Albert, and I kind of gave him like a 3-hour block, give a short introduction to inverse problems. And Albert stood up and he thought big, and after like 25 minutes, he said, actually, that's all I want to tell you. Let's just go to the beach. So, that's, you have to really, you have to have guts to have a 3-hour block, and after half an hour say, basically, that's all I need to tell you. That was Albert. So maybe I should say, Andreas, he was a student in Munich, and he was very, very interested in inverse problems. He was a very, very, very gifted student, so I thought, I want to send him to IBM.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Yeah, so I'm basically a second generation Tarantola. And I met Albert at this workshop where this picture came to be. And the first time I actually saw him was when he gave this lecture. And actually my variant of Heimer's anecdote is that he looked outside the window. It was beautiful weather. And he looked outside and thought, we should have beer. And that was the end of his lecture. So that's how I remember it. Yeah. And at that time it was already planned that I would go to Paris and work with him, or try to work with him. And so I went to Paris. That was after I had just, literally wasted the first year of my PhD. I had produced nothing, and just a bunch of crazy ideas. And I went to Paris, and I first met him really face to face with nobody else, in a small cafe in front of what was the IPG at that time. And our encounter was extremely short. He basically said, "Oh, you've come to chase French girls. Oh, have fun, go." That was it. So then the second encounter was like 2-3 days later, in his office in Café Beaubourg that you mentioned in the morning. The cafe was full, and I was accompanied by Jean-Paul Montagnier, fortunately. So we sat at the table, and as I said, I came with all my crazy ideas. I knew nothing, and his head turned redder and redder. I think everybody has experienced this. And at one point, he exploded and said, "This is all bullshit! Don't waste your life!"
You have to turn red first.
I can't. And come back with real data and solve a big problem. We were not alone in that cafe. And so, fortunately, Jean-Paul, he just took me aside. He obviously knew how to handle this kind of situations. And Jean-Paul guided me outside, and they gave me a quiet office at IPG. I tried to interact with Albert again, but it was a time where this was just impossible. And as a young student, this is something you need to digest. But the thing is, after some time, I did digest it, and in the end realized that, he was very loud, but he was not entirely wrong. And this, coming back with real data and not living in a total theoretical sphere, and trying to solve a big problem in order to actually not waste your life on something that's totally insignificant that maybe 1 million other people could solve. Well, this was actually something to take home. And so he was very, very loud. And I worked at IPG quietly for, I think, 3 months. the next time I saw him was also at that workshop in Utrecht, and he had totally forgotten who I was. And so we had a relaxed, short chat, and yeah, that was also the last time I saw him.
Maybe I add something to this Beaubourg story. So towards the end of my PhD, I went to see him. Actually, we were 2 or 3 students. We went to see him at Café Beaubourg. And one of the students started speaking, about physics in general, and again you could see Albert going redder and redder and redder and redder and redder. And we were sitting in the front row, and he had this explosion. He screamed at us and stood up and left. And we had to pay his bill. He just left. But I have to say, also at the very beginning, when you went to, and this didn't happen very often, and that's why I tell my students often who complain that they are not supervised correctly, because I'm the worst supervisor you can imagine, because you have a lot more supervision than I ever had. But so when you went into his office and you started talking about something, and probably most of you know that, you realize that suddenly you realize, actually I don't understand what I'm talking about. And you see on the other side somebody getting redder and redder, and it's Albert. It's an incredibly good school. It's amazing. Just simply this fear of going in there, not knowing what you're talking about, really, really helps. And I don't think I can be that kind of thing for my students, but that's really something, it's like it follows you in your dreams, but it's a great school. It's a really good school. So, Klaus.
Yeah, I think it's time for a more positive story.
They will come.
I've had my differences with Albert over the years, the 20 years, but not very many, but sometimes it was quite excited. But when I first met him, it was actually quite positive. I was a PhD student, and I was sitting at home with this heap of papers about inverse problems, trying to read everything. And then at some point I found a very strange paper from 1982, and that was the Tarantola ballet, and it was another one. It was 2 papers, and I started reading it. I thought it was actually much more interesting. It was strange, but it was much more interesting than the other papers. Something new and strange. But and I liked a lot that everything was they just insisted on probabilities everywhere. The reason why I liked it was that I happened to work with Monte Carlo methods in a slightly different way. I was actually doing my PhD in a hybrid between statistical mechanics and Monte Carlo algorithms. So we did basically statistical physics on that. So I had been working a lot on trying to analyze these things with defining heat capacities and density of states and all kinds of statistical mechanics things, and it was very, very interesting. So I had I had actually tried to take their paper from '82 and try to sample these probability distributions to see if it was possible to actually take this theory and make it practical. But it was kind of secret. I didn't dare tell anybody about it, especially not Albert. And then I happened to go to a theoretical geophysics meeting. I think it was perhaps in '88 in Blanes in Catalonia. I think it was a meeting there in '88. I think it was about there. And it was a fantastic experience. And Albert was giving a talk, and you could hear the way he was behaving. He was kind of ruling the waves. He was, but there were many, many interesting people there present. But then I noticed that Albert, he said that the way to do this is by Monte Carlo methods. And everybody was looking at him, looking very skeptical, but he was just very confident. He said, this is the way. And then there was a lunch break, and I happened to be just behind him on the line. And then I said, okay, now it's time. So I just kind kind of said to him, "Excuse me, can I have thank you very much for your talk, and I have a comment on that." And then I just said to him, he just looked at me a little bit, "Who's that guy?" I said, "Yes." And then I said, why don't we just sample those distributions?" And he didn't answer that question. He just said, "Are you going to give a talk?" "No, I have a poster." "Okay, where?" "Yeah, upstairs." "Okay, I will come." And then he disappeared. And then I went out there and was defending all my strange statistical mechanics. And then suddenly he came and he just stood and said, "Okay, explain everything." And I started explaining everything. And then when I was finished, he was okay. And then when I was finished, he said, "Okay, thank you very much." And then he left. And then 15 minutes later, he came back. He said, "Can you come to Paris?" That was it.
Oh, nice.
And then I went to Paris. And then I met Heine. So that was kind of of course, when I arrived, there were lots of surprising things in store. I also happened to be there close to a Thursday where there was a seminar, and it was pretty shocking. There was an American visitor, I think a PhD student, was going to give a talk. And I think, I don't know how long time he lasted, but 2 minutes after he started the talk, where he interrupted him and said, "Could you please explain your problem?" And I said to myself, "He already explained it." So, and the guy, he was just very surprised. He started again explaining, and he did it again. And then after he was finished, Albert said, he said, "Could you please explain your problem?" And then the guy tried again. He didn't really cope with. And then he said, "Look, this is Europe. It is not the United States." And the whole point was that, he didn't like the way the things were expressed. It was too relaxed and too sloppy and intuitive. He wanted some hard mathematics and some, But I think it was he took kind of pleasure in interrupting very early. So that's not the only story I have about that, but it's very much aligned with what you are talking about. So I have some mixed things, but it started very nicely.
But I also
You also won.
no, but I also want to say maybe the reason why we're all sitting here in a meeting that is kind of fun, and we're having fun, and it's a good atmosphere. I think that's something I learned from Albert. And I should say at that time in the world there were two groups working on sort of waveform inversion. There was this Stanford Exploration Project, SEP, that's actually still going strong, and also funded by the oil industry primarily. And there was the GTG group, Geophysical Tomography group. So you've seen GTG a lot today. It's called GTG. Actually, there was a Wikipedia entry at some point, but it's gone. I think, and so that group was funded by the oil industry, and if you at least at that time, when a group was funded in France, at least by the oil industry, somebody had the consortium credit card, and it was alleged that the consortium credit card. So we didn't go to Tour d'Argent, but close to this. So we would go out with the sponsors, we would go out to the group. We would have group meetings in the swimming pool. And I remember I actually, Albert invited me from Germany. I wasn't even there yet. And I brought some kind of an electric or a mechanical thing that, does this. And he goes to the water, and he loved it. He loved it. And that's what I liked about him. He was really, could be excited about these things. So one of his themes about the sponsors meeting, so they would have a sponsors meeting every year, and he used to do it in locations where they had a postdoc, a previous postdoc was living. So the first time we were in Morocco, because one of his postdocs was Moroccan. So we were in Marrakesh, and we didn't stay in the youth hostel. We stayed in the palace hotel that was just built by the prince and so forth. And as a student, you were,
For you.
Not for us, but it was just finished, and so it was a place where you would go to the swimming pool, you would sit down, and then somebody would come with a towel and what do you want to drink and so forth. I've almost felt uncomfortable, and this was almost exactly 30 years ago.
Only almost.
This was a couple of days before the start of the Gulf War, which is, as you probably, some of you remember, Morocco at the time was kind of at the same side as Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Kuwait, and so it resulted in the fact that actually all the American sponsors didn't come. So we were like 10, 15 PhD students and a couple of other French people from companies, and that was it. But it was luxury pure. And so the meeting 3 days, and the middle day was free. In the morning you would meet outside, and there was a row of 10 rental cars. Everybody, students, we just got into the rental car, we go up into the Atlas, and had an organized, an amazing festivities and dinner somewhere organized in Morocco. Unfortunately, everybody got sick and got vomiting except me, because I happened to be on antibiotics for some reason, I can't remember. But so this was the kind of thing. Another meeting was in Montana with all the American sponsors. This was 2 years later or so, and we visited the Yellowstone Park. And and this was it was quite cold. I remember there was snow, and so it was beautiful. You have the steam coming out of the floor, the ground, and so we were walking, and somebody told it was my idea. So we walked to this river where somebody said there's a hot river and a cold river flowing together. And so we went there, and we were young students. We take off our clothes and go in the water. So there were these ponds with different, and Albert took off his clothes and went into the water. We were naked in the water. Albert was very relaxed about this. And I remember this was like a river, and on the side up there were the sponsors with ties standing there, looking down, shaking their heads. And we were, this is my favorite word in the English language, frolicking. We were really frolicking, screaming in this hot water. And that's one of those stories. So Albert always had ideas about where can we put the next sponsors meeting. He loves Formula One. He really was a big fan of Formula One, so he asked his secretary, can you please find out what's the price of a hotel during the Monte Carlo race. This is always in May in Monte Carlo. So she came back and said, well, it looks like it's like, 10,000 francs a night, so he dropped that idea. So he had another idea on having a meeting on a boat going through the canals of France. So it was really that spirit. You do something special that really I took. And as some of you remember, we had the chance of having like almost 10 years of funding to organize workshops in Europe. And and that was great fun. It was really in his spirit that we carried out this workshop. And I'm totally sure this is the spirit in which I conceived, this kind of event here. And then that's thanks to Albert. So, Rachel.
Yeah, so I'm a geologist and paleontologist. I only met Albert a couple of times, and I can't really talk to his intellect, which clearly was formidable. But I can share an anecdote that gives you an insight into his personality, very much following on from what Heiner has said. Not quite frolicking, but nearly frolicking. So Andrew and I used to work for Schlumberger, and I had to organise the seminar series for our group. And we were always looking for names of external speakers, and Andrew suggested Albert. And it rested on the departmental administrator to do all the logistics of inviting him. So she came to my office one day, she said, this person, Albert Tarantola, he is appalling. I just can't organise anything with him. He says he will only come to Cambridge if he can sleep in the room of Sir Isaac Newton. What on earth am I going to do? So we obviously, I did a bit of sleuthing, and we discovered there was no way he could possibly sleep in the room of Isaac Newton. It was occupied by somebody else that we couldn't eject. But I went to my own college, and I discovered that he could sleep in the room of a very famous entomologist, in fact a cockroach specialist, called Sir Vincent Wigglesworth, and it was called the Wigglesworth Room. So we offered Albert the Wigglesworth Room. And Albert said, I will only come if I can sleep in the Wigglesworth Room, plus you organise a midnight punt down the River Cam. Okay, so then Claire, the administrator, who at this stage realised this is an incredibly irritating, high-maintenance guest. Why on earth have we invited them? Anyway, we managed to organise this midnight punt down the Cam. So, and we thought because Claire had, I can't remember how many of us got together for this, but we organised hot water bottles, flask of hot chocolate, maybe even some hot whiskey, blankets. And we thought Claire, because she had just suffered all this logistical nightmare with Albert, we thought we would invite her too. And she said, I will come, but I will not go anywhere near him. I'm not going to share a punt with Albert. Anyway, the moment we got there, Claire was on her own. Albert said, who is Claire? Albert walked over to Claire. Madame, please, will you come punting with me? He took Claire, and it was only Claire and Albert in the punt. They sailed off. It was one of those magical, clear, starry nights. It was probably a moon. It was all ridiculously romantic. And anyway, Claire, when we docked again, Claire had a huge smile on her face. She said, he is the most charming man I've ever met. That's my main memory of Albert.
Excellent, great story.
That's really young, yeah.
Maybe one of the important things is, and I think that also is echoed here, if you worked with Albert, it was not a professional relationship. It was a love-hate relationship maybe, and we had fist fights also in the corridor.
Yeah, both at the same time within 10 seconds.
I would like to share the story. Like I had my 30th birthday, and we decided to celebrate on one of the tips near Pont Neuf on Ile de la Cité. So we were like, I don't know, 7-8 people, and we got there. We sat down, and we had wine and cheese and everything. And Albert brought 10 candles. 10 candles. It was a very windy day. And then we had brought a box, with the stuff to sit on and so forth. So then Albert decided, it's your 30th birthday. We need 30 candles. So he took a knife, and it took forever. He took a knife and he cut each candle in 3 and placed them inside the box, and didn't stop until all the 30 candles were lit, which took, I don't know, forever, because it was a very, very windy day. So, it's just something very personal. I mean, is your supervisor spending your 30th birthday with you? That's amazing. And I have to say, when at his funeral, or in his, we realized just from the people who were there, we were his family. And that's something I actually only realized then, really. He had a few very, very, very close and good friends, but we were his family. And he was always curious what happened to us. He, played with our kids. I remember that he sort of chased my daughter in one of these scooters around in Cambridge, where we lived at the time. So that's just another aspect of this. It's more than a professional relationship.
But as we can hear from the story, he was quite, I don't know what the English word, grandiose, can you say that? Yeah. And at some point, and managed somehow to convince the University of Copenhagen that he should be a doctor, honorable doctor. So he came there, and the biggest thing there for him was that he was going to shake hands with the Queen. And he did that, and that just made his day. It was amazing.
He's here.
And it turned out the prince, who passed away a couple of years ago, he was actually French, and was very eloquent. So he could, when I followed them, and then they had a very nice conversation, and he was very good at interviewing him about what he was doing. And but this whole setup with the Queen, that was something special. There's only he liked that, but there's only once I have heard him his grandiose view being challenged, and that was one day when he was visiting us at home in our flat in Copenhagen, and it was in the evening, and it was in the middle. It was in the middle of I think it was not in the summer, but it was in the spring, I think, several years ago, and there was, and I remember there was very nice weather. It was a clear sky outside. It was fantastic, and he was sitting there, and as usual, Albert, he was talking. I mean, he was lecturing about his views of things, and then at some point he he expressed a sentence, something like, I don't think that God would have permitted that. And in the very second he said that, there was a thunder outside and a lightning. Sometimes that happens, just out of the blue. It was very, very strong, and he was completely silent. And that was it. There was no rain, and it just came. And to this day, I think it was probably God who was watching him say, "Now it's too much. We had to stop that guy now." And it works.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's a good final statement, final story. Thanks very much for sharing all your stories.